The moment I realized they weren't coming back, the ferry horn had already faded into the fog. I stood on the dock in Horseshoe Bay, with my overnight bag hanging off one shoulder and my phone dead in my pocket, watching the white stern of the BC Ferry's vessel disappear into the gray November morning. My sister-in-law was on that boat, so was my husband, so was his mother, and every single one of them knew I wasn't. I kept telling myself there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe they thought I was already on board. Maybe they lost me in the crowd at the terminal. Maybe someone would call the passenger services desk, and I'd hear my name over the loudspeaker any second now. I stood there for a long time, long enough for the cold to settle into the bones of my fingers, long enough for the dock workers to start glancing at me sideways. A woman alone, no coat heavy enough for this, not moving. Nobody called my name. I want to tell you how I got to that dock, because I think the beginning matters. I think you can't understand what happened on that ferry terminal without knowing what the 8 years before it looked like. You can't understand why I stood there frozen instead of screaming, unless you understand that I'd been trained, very carefully and very slowly, not to make a scene. My husband and I met in our late 20s at a mutual friend's birthday party in Kitchener. He was funny, that's the first thing I noticed. Not his looks, though he was handsome enough, but the way he could make a whole room laugh without trying. He was easy to be around. Easy to love at first. We got married 4 years in, a small ceremony at a conservation area outside the city, and I remember thinking that afternoon that I had somehow ended up with exactly the life I wanted. I was 31. I was an optimist. I didn't yet understand what I was marrying into. His family is from a small town about 2 hours east of Toronto. His mother has lived in the same house for 40 years. His sister, who is 3 years older than him, has lived 3 streets away from that house for the last decade. She married a man who grew up in the same town, went to the same high school, and still talks about their hockey team's provincial championship from 2003 like it happened last week. They are a unit. They have always been a unit, and from the very beginning, I was something that existed just outside of it. I tried. I want to be clear about that. I tried for years. I drove 4 hours round trip every holiday. I learned his mother's recipes. I remembered everyone's birthdays. I sat through 6-hour Christmas dinners listening to stories about people I'd never met and laughed in the right places. I thought that was what you did. I thought eventually the trying would turn into belonging. What I didn't understand then was that there was no mechanism for me to belong. Not because I wasn't likable, not because I did anything wrong, but because his sister had decided, very early on, that I was a threat to something she considered hers. I learned this slowly, in small humiliations, a comment about how I'd pronounce something. A laugh shared between her and my mother-in-law when I talked about my job. Little things you couldn't really confront without looking crazy. My husband noticed some of it, not all of it. He had the particular blindness that happens when you've grown up inside something, and it just looks like normal to you. When I'd bring things up, he'd say, "That's just how she is," or "She doesn't mean anything by it," and I believed him for longer than I should have. Because I wanted to. Because the alternative was harder. The trip to Vancouver Island was his sister's idea. A family-long weekend in November. Her husband's cousins had a cabin outside of Nanaimo, big enough for everyone, the kind of trip they'd been talking about for years. She extended the invitation to include me, in the way she always extended invitations to me, which was to say, she mentioned it to my husband, and assumed he'd sort out the details. I found out the full itinerary about a week before we were supposed to leave. The plan was to drive from Ontario, which makes no sense over a long weekend, so we were flying into Vancouver, and then driving to Horseshoe Bay for the ferry to Nanaimo. My mother-in-law flew out the day before us. My sister-in-law and her husband drove separately from Victoria, where they'd been visiting friends, and were meeting us at the terminal. I remember the morning of the ferry clearly. We'd stayed the night at a hotel near the terminal, and my husband was in a good mood, the kind of loose, easy mood he got on vacation, and I let myself relax into it. His sister and her husband met us in the ferry terminal parking lot around 8 in the morning. It was cold and foggy, and the kind of damp that finds its way through every layer. My mother-in-law was already there, sitting in her daughter's car with a Tim Hortons cup. We stood around in the parking lot while my brother-in-law went to sort something with the vehicle reservation. I needed to use the washroom. The terminal building was maybe 200 meters from where we were parked. I told my husband I'd be right back and went inside. I was gone maybe 8 minutes. When I came back outside, the cars were gone. I stood in the parking lot and turned a full circle, like I'd somehow missed them, like they'd parked somewhere else. Like I was confused about which lot we'd been in. I wasn't confused. The spot was empty. I had watched us park there. I remembered the number on the concrete pillar, 14. I ran to the terminal. The departure gate was closed. I could see through the windows to the loading area and the ramp was already pulled back. I started trying to wave someone down, a BC Ferry's employee, anyone, and a woman in a vest finally came over and I told her what happened. She was kind. She looked genuinely sorry. She said the sailing had departed, and she couldn't do anything about that now. I asked if she could reach the vessel. She said she'd try. She came back 10 minutes later and told me that she had been unable to make contact with anyone in my party. They had my phone charger. It was in my husband's carry-on. My phone had died sometime during the drive from the hotel, and I hadn't thought anything of it because I wasn't driving and I assumed I'd charge it on the ferry. I was completely unreachable and I had no way to reach anyone. I had my wallet. I want to say that clearly because someone in your position needs to know that I wasn't completely helpless, even though I felt that way. I had my wallet with my debit card and maybe $60 cash. I had my overnight bag. I was wearing a good coat. I was an adult woman in Horseshoe Bay, British Columbia, not in any immediate danger. But I stood in that terminal and I could not move, because somewhere in the back of my mind, the part I'd been trying to quiet for 8 years, a voice said, they knew. A man sitting on the bench near the terminal door noticed me. He was maybe 65, reading a paperback, the kind of person who looks like they've done a lot of sitting in a lot of ferry terminals. He didn't say anything intrusive. He just looked up and said, "You missed the boat?" I said yes. He folded down the corner of his page and said, "There's a cafe across the road. They'll let you sit as long as you need." I don't know why that was the thing that cracked me open, but it was. I thanked him and walked across the road and sat in a window seat at a small cafe and ordered a tea I couldn't really taste, and I cried quietly into a paper napkin for about 20 minutes. The woman who brought my tea was somewhere in her 50s. She had the kind of face that doesn't perform sympathy, it just has it. She didn't ask me anything. She brought me a second tea without being asked, and put a small plate of shortbread on the table and said, "Take your time." After a while I used the cafe's phone. They had a landline, and they let me use it without hesitation. The way people used to just let you use their phones because that was the normal thing to do. And I called my husband's number. It went to voicemail. I called his sister's number, which I knew because I'd made the effort years ago to memorize it, and it also went to voicemail. I left a message on my husband's that was careful and flat. I said I had missed the ferry. I said I was at a cafe in Horseshoe Bay. I said, "Please call this number." Nobody called back. I sat with that for a while. I ordered soup because the woman offered it, and because I hadn't eaten, and because accepting kindness from a stranger in a cafe felt, at that moment, like the only thing I was capable of. She sat across from me for a few minutes when the lunch rush slowed down, and I don't know what she saw in my face, but she said quietly, "Is there someone you can call?" I thought about that question, really thought about it. Who would I call? My parents were in London, Ontario. My best friend from university was 3 time zones in the wrong direction. I had spent 8 years making my husband's family my primary social world, and I was now sitting alone on the West Coast with a dead phone and $60, and a slowly clarifying understanding that the people I should have been able to count on had not, in fact, waited for me. I called my mother. Not because she could do anything practical. She was 1,100 kilometers away. But because I needed to hear a voice that would not make me feel like I was being unreasonable for being upset. She answered on the second ring, and when I told her what happened, she didn't say anything for a moment, and then she said, "Okay, here's what you're going to do." My mother has always been practical in a crisis. She told me to find the next available ferry, buy a ticket, and get myself to Nanaimo. She told me to charge my phone at the cafe if they had an outlet available, which they did. The woman brought me a universal charger from behind the counter without me even finishing the sentence. My mother told me to take a photo of every receipt. She told me not to call my husband again until my phone was charged and I had a plan. She also said, and I remember this exactly, whatever their explanation is, it's going to be very important. The next ferry departed in just under 2 hours. I bought a foot passenger ticket at the terminal, $41, and I remember the exact amount because I stood there calculating whether I could manage the rest of the day on what I had left. I went back to the cafe and sat with my phone charging and my mother on the other end of the line, talking about nothing in particular, just keeping me company across the distance. My phone came back to life at 12%. I had 7 text messages. 3 were from my husband. The first said, "Hey, where are you? We're about to board." The second, Sent about 15 minutes later. We're on. Can't find you. The third. Sent over an hour after that. Hope you caught a later sailing. Signal is bad. See you at the cabin. One was from my sister-in-law. It said, "Lol, did you wander off? Hope you find your way in." I read that message 4 times. Then I put my phone face down on the table and looked at the window at the parking lot. 2 of the remaining messages were automated. One was from my mother asking me to text her when I was on the ferry. The last one was from my husband again, sent about 20 minutes before my phone came back. Mom thinks it's hilarious, beat away. She said she knew you'd be fine, you're resourceful. Anyway, signal comes and goes out here. See you tonight. Mom thinks it's hilarious. She knew you'd be fine. I sat with those words. I let them settle. And something in my chest that had been wound tight for 8 years, something I had been too afraid to look at directly, quietly started to unwind. Not in a peaceful way. In the way a knot unravels when you finally admit you've been pulling it the wrong direction the whole time. The ferry crossing is about an hour and 35 minutes. I stood outside on the deck for most of it, even though it was cold, because I needed the air. I watched the mainland disappear and the islands come forward, and I thought about 8 years of small moments that I had talked myself out of taking seriously. The comment at Easter that I let slide. The holiday dinner where they spent an hour talking about a family trip that happened before I existed and nobody thought to catch me up. The birthday last year when my sister-in-law said, in front of everyone, that she thought it was funny how I'd never quite figured out how their family worked. And everyone had laughed. My husband had laughed. I had smiled because what else do you do? I thought about the voicemails I'd left, the missed calls, the cafe landline, the fact that between the 4 of them, my husband, his sister, his brother-in-law, his mother, not one of them had thought to go back. Not one of them had gotten off the ferry. Not one of them had stayed on the dock. By the time the island came into view, I knew some things clearly that I had only suspected before. The cabin was about 40 minutes from the Nanaimo terminal. I took a taxi, which cost more than I wanted to spend, and which I paid for without hesitation, because I was done making myself small about money. The driver was chatty in a pleasant way, and when I told him I'd missed the morning ferry, he said, sympathetically, "Happens to everyone at least once." I said, "Yes." When I arrived at the cabin, my husband came outside before I even got the taxi door open. He was wearing his good flannel and he looked relieved and he said, "There she is," in a tone I recognized, the tone he used to smooth things over, to signal to everyone watching that everything was fine now. His sister came out behind him. She had a glass of wine already and she was smiling and she said, "We were wondering when you'd show up. Did you have an adventure?" I looked at her. I want you to understand that I looked at her for a long moment without saying anything, and in that moment, I made a decision that had probably been building for 8 years. I said, "Can I talk to you inside?" What followed was a conversation I am not going to dramatize for you, because it wasn't dramatic. It was very quiet. I sat at the kitchen table in that cabin, with the sounds of the island outside, and the rest of the family somewhere in the back of the house, and I told my husband exactly what the morning had felt like. I told him about standing in the parking lot at B14. I told him about the terminal employee, and the man with the paperback and the cafe, and the woman who brought me shortbread. I told him about the texts. I recited his sister's message word for word, including the laughing emoji. He said he was sorry. He said he genuinely thought I was already on the boat. He said everything happened so fast. He said his mother didn't mean anything by her comment. She was just trying to lighten the mood. I said, "I know you think that." He said, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means I've been trying to tell you things for a long time and you hear them very differently than I say them." He said he didn't know what I wanted from him. I said, "I know." That was the night I stopped trying to be understood by people who had already decided what I was, not in anger, not in a dramatic declaration. I just stopped. The way you stop trying to open a door when you finally understand it isn't a door. I stayed for the rest of the weekend because I'd already paid for the flights home and because I am, at my core, someone who honors commitments even when they cost me. But I was different. I laughed at dinner when something was funny, not because I needed anyone to know I was okay. I went to bed when I was tired instead of sitting up to prove I belonged in the conversation. I stopped monitoring my sister-in-law's expression to see if I was making her comfortable. On the last morning, while everyone else was loading the cars, my mother-in-law came and stood beside me on the porch. She looked out at the water, and after a while she said, "You're not going to let this go, are you?" It wasn't really a question. I said, "I'm not sure what you mean," she said. "I know my son, and I know when something shifted." I thought about what to say. I thought about 8 years of trying to answer her in ways she'd approve of. Then I said, I think you're right, something has shifted. She didn't say anything else. She went inside, and I stayed on the porch until the car was loaded, watching a heron standing absolutely still in the shallows below the cabin. There's something about a heron. The way it can wait without looking like it's waiting. The way it doesn't betray its intention until the last possible second. The flight home was quiet. My husband held my hand on the plane, and I let him and I didn't say much. I watched the prairies come and go below us, and then the familiar flatness of southern Ontario, and I thought about my apartment before I was married. The one on Herb Street with the yellow kitchen, and the radiator that clanged all winter, and how I had never once wondered, in that apartment, whether I was too much or too little or failing to fit into something that wasn't built for me. I want to be honest with you. The version of this story where I walked off that ferry and never looked back is not exactly what happened. What happened is messier and longer, and I'm still in the middle of it. I'm living in my own apartment now. Not the one on Herb Street, a different one, also in Kitchener, with better windows. My husband and I have been separated for 7 months. We're doing the slow, careful Canadian bureaucratic work of figuring out what's next, and some days that's fine and some days it isn't. But here is what I know, standing on the other side of that ferry dock, I know that the morning in Horseshoe Bay didn't make me understand something new. It confirmed something I'd already known and been afraid to say out loud. The taxi driver was wrong, actually. It doesn't happen to everyone. Being left isn't something that just happens. There are people who check that everyone is accounted for before they get on the boat. There are people who would get off the boat. And there are people who send you a laughing emoji. I know that a stranger in a cafe will sometimes offer you shortbread and a phone charger when your family won't offer you a second look. I know that kindness has very little to do with blood. I know that my mother was right about the explanation being important. Not because a good explanation would have fixed anything, but because the explanation they gave me told me exactly who they were. They thought it was funny. They thought I'd be fine because I was resourceful. They thought the story of how I got left behind would become one of those family stories. The ones they'd tell at dinner tables for years, the time she wandered off and had to catch the next ferry. And I'd be sitting there, smiling in the right places, because that's what I'd always done. I took the $41 out of my account records when I was separating our finances. I'm not sure why I kept track of it. Maybe because it felt important to have evidence that I'd managed, that I'd bought the ticket, that I'd gotten myself to the island on my own, and it had cost me $41 and 2 hours and 8 years of pretending. There's a photo on my phone from the ferry crossing. I don't remember taking it. It's just the water and the sky and the bow of the boat cutting through the gray, and I'm not in it at all. It looks like a photo someone took who wasn't afraid of where they were going. I look at it sometimes when I need to remember that I can stand on a deck in the cold and watch the land recede behind me without falling apart. The heron was still in the shallows when the cars left that morning. I watched it until we turned the corner and I couldn't see it anymore. Still waiting, still sure of itself, still absolutely unbothered by the fact that nobody else had stopped to look.